three figures standing over a body. The body is the size of the world they are about to build. None of them speak. One of them has blood on his hand, dark, warm, already cooling in the cold air. A single drop falls from the blade he's still holding, and when it strikes the ice below him, it makes the first sound the world has ever heard. He is young. So young he doesn't yet have the name history will give him. His two brothers stand a little behind him, breathing hard, eyes not quite meeting his. None of them know what happens next, because no one has ever done this before. There is no word yet for what they have just become. Remember this picture. Hold it. Because everything that follows is the story of how three young gods came to be standing over the first corpse in existence, and what they did next to make the evidence disappear. Before the world, there was a gap. Not darkness, a gap. Not silence, a gap. The difference matters. Darkness implies something that could be lit. Silence implies something that could be broken. A gap is something else entirely, an absence with edges, and the edges were moving. To the north, a world of ice so cold the frost didn't fall, it accumulated, pressing south like a wall that had been building since before time had anything to count. To the south, a world of fire so absolute that its sparks didn't rise. They drifted, carried north on heat that had nowhere else to go. Between them, the gap. The Norse called it Ginnungagap, two impossible fronts grinding toward each other across an absence that had no floor, no ceiling, no sides, only the two edges, closing. When the heat reached the advancing ice, it didn't melt it cleanly. It sweated it. The rime thawed in slow drops, each drop thick with something. The oldest versions of this story call it venom, which is their way of saying, this wasn't clean water. This was a substance with intent. In the steam rising from that collision, something began to condense. Not quickly. The shape gathered itself across a stillness that had no measure, and what finally lay there was enormous, slow-breathing, warm, utterly at rest. The gap had made something. No one had asked it to. He was enormous. That's the first thing. Before the name, just the sheer fact of his size. He lay in the steam between the ice and the fire, and he breathed, and his breathing was the first sound the void had ever held. He slept, not because he was weak, because there was nowhere to go, nothing to do, no world yet in which a being could have a purpose. He simply was. And while he slept, his body did what bodies do. It other shapes condensed along the warmth of his skin. They rose from the sweat beneath his arms. His legs tangled together in the dark and made a sun. He hadn't decided to do this. Life was simply what happened when something vast and warm existed in a place that had always been cold. He wasn't evil. He wasn't dangerous. He was first. His name was Ymir. In that warm, slow-breathing body lay every possible future this world might have had. A cosmos that grew instead of being cut. We will never know what that would have looked like, because three of his descendants were on their way. There was something else in the dark. Where Ymir was warm and generating, this was hungry. Patient in a way that was almost its own kind of sleep. She was pale and enormous, a primordial cow if the word cow can carry enough weight. The old texts call her Audhumla. She moved through the steam toward the salt blocks that had formed where ice met warmer air, lowered her head, and began to lick. On the first day, her rough tongue found hair. On the second day, a head emerged from the frost. On the third day, the full form of a figure stood free of the block, pale and slow and blinking in the steam. His name was Buri, the first of his kind, not a giant, not a creature of the void, but something else. From him, in the usual way that lineages begin, would come a son. From that son, 3 grandsons. Those 3 grandsons are the ones whose hands you saw at the beginning. Their mother was a giantess, kin to the frost and the steam, kin to the vast sleeping form in the mist, which meant the 3 sons she bore were something the void had never produced before, beings who carried both lineages in the same body, divine and giant, ice and fire folded into one. Their names were Odin, Vili, and Ve, and Odin was the eldest. The sources don't tell us why. That's the thing you need to hold onto, not a gap in the record, not a detail lost to time. The mythology itself refuses, across 1,000 years of telling, to give a reason for what happens next. It is a silence the story chose. The 3 of them stood before Ymir. He was sleeping. He was always sleeping. That enormous, unhurried body in the mist. The body that had been here before anything else, that would have gone on being first indefinitely. His chest rose and fell in the cold. Odin stood over him. He was young, not young the way a man is young the way a thing is young when it has never done what it's about to do, and no one in the history of existence has done it before, and there is no word for what happens next, because the word has not been needed yet. Behind him, the void. Still waiting. Still the only place a sound could get lost forever. In front of him, Ymir's breath moved the air. Vili was there. They was there. Each of them gripping half a heritage that had no precedent, with no one in all existence to tell them whether what they were about to do was allowed. Odin's hand moved. Vili moved a half-second after, Ve a half-second after that. What came out of Ymir was not like anything that had ever fallen in the void before. It was warm. That was the first impossible thing. Everything in the void had been cold. The ice, the steam, the skin of the creature sleeping in it. But the blood was warm, and it moved fast, and it didn't stop. It ran across the ice in dark sheets, thin at first, then deeper still. The giants who had been born from Ymir's sleeping body woke to find the floor of the world rising toward them. Not in waves, not with warning, just a slow, dark tide climbing every surface at once, swallowing every low place where a giant might stand. They didn't fight it. There was nothing to fight. The blood wasn't an enemy. It was simply everywhere. And then it was above them, and then they were gone. All of them. Every giant in the void. The entire race that had grown unconsciously from the body of the first being, drowned in the fluid that had kept that being alive. The killing of one became the killing of all. except for two. His name was Ymir. He and his wife were already in a wooden chest, the most primitive vessel imaginable. When the flood reached its height, they rose with it. They didn't understand what they were surviving. They only understood that the floor was gone and the chest was holding, and the blood-dark water was still rising around them in every direction as far as they could see. Their children would survive. Their children's children would eventually meet Thor's hammer, and they would remember where they came from, what had been done to the one they descended from, how his blood had become the sea that almost swallowed them all. The debt was already there before a single stone had been placed. The body was still there. Vast, cooling, the size of everything that would ever exist. What do you do with a corpse that large? You work. The three of them began with the flesh, cold the way stone is cold, with a weight beneath it that doesn't yield. They laid it down across the void, and where it settled, it spread in long, slow rolls, in heavy folds that would take millennia to harden into something you could call ground. That was the earth, the first earth. A body laid down flat in the dark. The blood had already done its work. It had drowned nearly everything, and now it found the low places in the flesh and pooled there, dark and still. That was the sea. Not a beautiful sea, not a sea anyone had named yet. Just blood, settled and cold, going quiet in the void. Vili and Ve worked the bones. They were enormous, the kind of enormous that makes you recalibrate what the word means. Each one stood upright, and where a bone stood, it kept standing. Nothing that size falls easily. Those became the mountains, still vertical, still resisting, long after everything else had been laid flat. And then Odin reached for the skull. He had been working without stopping. The work had a rhythm by now. Lay this here, stand this there, pour this into the low places. And the rhythm had kept him from having to think about what the material was. But the skull was different. It had the shape of something that had once looked back at you. The eye sockets were empty now, but they faced the same direction they'd always faced, and the skull was heavier than anything Odin had ever lifted. He stood there with it. The weight was physical, but there was something in the weight that wasn't muscle or bone. He couldn't have told you what it was. He may not have tried. Then the skull went up. It rose slowly. It had to. It was the largest thing any hands had ever lifted. And when it reached the height it needed to reach, it stayed. A dome of bone over an earth of flesh and a sea of blood. The skull became the sky. And at the edge of what the three of them had built, they took the great curved ridges of bone above the empty sockets, the brow of the dead giant, and they curved them into a wall, a barrier between the place where the work had been done and the outer dark where Ymir still floated. That wall became Midgard, the middle realm, the world of what would eventually be human, erected from a dead giant's brow, curved like a question into the emptiness, keeping the outside out. The world is beautiful. That's true. And the world is a body. That's also true. Neither of those things cancels the other. Every horizon you have ever seen is the edge of that flesh. Every mountain range is a bone that refused to fall. Every sea is the blood of the first being, the one who was vast and sleeping, and not evil, only first. Odin stood in it, young, exhausted, covered in what the work leaves on you. The maker of everything that would ever be made, standing in a world built from a crime. The world was finished. And it was quiet in the way that only enormous things are quiet. Not peaceful, but empty of anything that could fill it. Odin walked to the shore. Not the shore of a sea he had chosen. The shore of Ymir's blood, gone cold and gray and flat under a sky that was Ymir's skull. He walked on flesh. He breathed air held inside bone. Everything he touched was something he had taken. There were 2 pieces of driftwood at the waterline. Just wood, nothing chosen about them, nothing sacred. His brothers were with him, the same brothers who had held the body while the blood ran out, the same hands. They carved, unhurried. The wood was there. They had hands. What moved in the 3 of them that gray morning, whether it was pity or instinct or simply the motion of hands that did not know how to stop, the mythology keeps that silence too. The first one received intelligence, then movement, then sensation spreading through him like something being remembered. His name was Ask. Beside him, the second piece of driftwood opened her eyes. Embla. She blinked at the same gray water, the same cold sky, with no knowledge of what either of them were standing inside. They were small. The world around them was the size of a corpse, because it was a corpse, and they would never know that. They would call the mountains beautiful. They would name the sea. Odin looked at them. The same hands that had opened Ymir had now opened this. The 3 brothers who had drained a sleeping body had just given breath to 2 standing ones. The mythology makes no attempt to reconcile those hands. It lets them belong to the same people and leaves the reconciliation to whoever is listening. He stood at the gray border where Midgard's wall met the outer dark and looked out. The giants were still out there. Not all of them had drowned. Bergelmir's children had multiplied in the years since the flood, and they remembered. He could not see them, but he knew the shape of that dark the way you know a room you have slept in long enough. They were in it, waiting. Just waiting the way the aggrieved wait, without urgency, with all the time that exists. He was the Allfather now. That was what he was called. The word arrived without ceremony, the way all permanent things do. Not given, just gradually, undeniably true. Behind him, Ask and Embla were already forgetting. They would build fires. They would name rivers. They would have children, and those children would have children, and the long forgetting would become a civilization, and none of them would ever know what the ground beneath their feet actually was. He knew. He had always known. He had not created a world. He had committed a crime and built scenery over the body. He turned his face toward the dark where the giants waited, and somewhere behind him, on a shore he would never walk again, a fire was already burning.